In 1968, an ecologist named Garrett Hardin published an essay titled Tragedy of the Commons. And just like the title suggests, there are two major things to focus on here: the tragedy and commons. So I'll explain what tragedy means from the context that Hardin described. So, commons refers to something that belongs to a community, a common room, a space that everybody has access to within a community, within a locality. And then eventually I'll get to tragedy. And so in this context, he referred to a field within a locality where everyone, farmers, were allowed to bring their cattle to for grazing. And because it belonged to everyone, everyone could come with as many cows as they had every day if they like, or if there was a need to. And what this meant was that the cows became fatter and they grew, and there was yield for the farmers. But over time, the field stopped producing enough grass because obviously there was simply no time for recovery. Everyone was feeding off, everyone's cows was feeding off every day. This is what represents a tragedy because at some point there is no longer grass for the cattle, which means at some point your cows begin to be malnourished and they become, well, you can't make any profit from that. And it becomes the question, why do human beings destroy the things that they need? And I'll put this in some other context. If you look at oceans, for instance, you have plastic pollution in the oceans at alarming rates. We have biodiversity loss. We even have things like overfishing. If you, we, I'm sure we must have heard about things like endangered species, where that when you ultimately leads to a change and a deviation in the ecosystem, where something when something disappears from the ecosystem, there's an effect on the food chain. So take for instance when I think there's I can't remember which country where there were situations of people hunting lions, and when people began to hunt lions, ultimately mountain goats begin to produce so much because the lions ultimately in that region became extinct and the lions fed on mountain goats. And because the lions fed on mountain goats and they were no longer lions in that region, mountain goats continued to produce and produce. And eventually, because goats eat grass, the farmlands began to be affected. And then, so this is ultimately how the entire ecosystem is affected. One action has a cascading butterfly effect across the entire food chain, across the entire ecosystem. And so I will now link this to social life, sociology, and our experiences within the Nigerian landscape. Every day, we hear about people stealing large sums of public money, embezzlement, and this has been going on for years, maybe as old as Nigeria, as long as Nigeria has existed. We have funds disappearing to the tune of billions and trillions of naira. In fact, we have that as of today, as I think and the Debt Management Office published this in December 2015, if memory serves me right. Nigeria is in has a debt profile of 159 trillion naira, which translates to about $111 billion in debt. And it's easy to think that, well, we'll pay back. But the question is, when you say Nigeria is in debt, who is Nigeria? What is Nigeria? Right? Is Nigeria the land? Right? Is it the oil, the gas, the farmland, or is it the people? Because it's easy to think of Nigeria just in terms of geography, and we forget that it is the people that gives Nigeria its Nigerianness. Um, Now, why is this important? If we continue to lose resources, we will continue to steal and take resources. Ultimately, we begin to see the effect. We now have schools which are underfunded. In fact, I'll backtrack. We have a culture where people get into public offices with the intention, with the goal of simply looting. In fact, we have a president who campaigned, and during the campaign period, he made a statement, "It is my turn." And this has been the mentality of many people who have gone into politics. It's my turn. I've served. It's my turn to get in there. I've served under one politician or the other, so it is my turn. It is my turn, not because you want to go in there and perform the responsibilities of that the office demands, but because it is your turn to determine how the resources move, where they move to, and which ones or how much is embezzled. And we might be tempted to think that this is isolated to the political system, but that's not true. We have a lot of entrepreneurs who complain bitterly that when they employ people in their businesses, people steal from them, people pilfer. If you go to any civil service office, there's a high chance that before something gets done, you have to grease somebody's elbow. In fact, you have the university students graduate from university, and when they go for clearance, even when they have all the right, appropriate documentation and they've paid all the correct fees, somebody says, before I sign your clearance form, you have to give me XYZ amount of money. These are common themes across the country. And the reason we have this is what I would describe as the tragedy of the commons. Because what ultimately happens is that because everybody has a culture of it's my office, so this is where I make my money, and this is where I plunder the resources, or it is my turn. I'm the president. I'm the governor. I take as much as I want. I amass generational wealth, my family. What ultimately happens is that schools don't get funded. The security infrastructure does not get funded. You have that the if you don't fund the security infrastructure, the security officials have to find a way to fend for themselves. We begin to see the cascading effect, the tragedy of the commons. Um, we have a situation whereby kids have been kidnapped and people are playing politics with it. These are all what I describe as a tragedy of the commons. We have a situation where people are agitating over pipeline contracts, and one may think that this agitation is about security, but in reality, it's about taking their share of quote unquote the national cake. In fact, it's even worrisome how something like national cake has come into the vocabulary of Nigerians. But it's just something that we should worry about. But then the thing is, there are solutions to these things. I think years after Garrett Hardin published this essay, someone else named Eleanor Ostrom carried out some research and then came up with solutions to this tragedy. And they're not rocket science, and these are not solutions that are abstract. These are solutions that we know and recognize. And a few of them are things like one, shared responsibility. So when we take a look at the field, the example of the field, the farmland where people were coming to graze their cattle, if we now have shared responsibility, what it means is today I water the grass, and tomorrow you water the grass, and the day after somebody else waters the grass. And this means that because I now water the grass, and because we now have responsibility to water the grass, we all now contribute to taking care of that farmland, to ensuring that it is sustained. We also have, well, they also published, well, Eleanor also came up with other solutions like things like rules and regulations. So, for instance, how many how much cattle can you take to the farmland per day, right? Or do we graze between 7 a.m. and 12 noon and leave the farmland between 12 till the next 7 a.m.? Like you come up with these rules and regulations. So things like in the context of social life, we have constitution, right, which guides how we operate. We have things like procurement regulations, which determine how we buy stuff. We have things like environmental regulations which determine how we waste stuff. And so these are examples of rules and regulations that can be put in place to ensure that the commons are well catered for. But then more importantly, we also have cultural reorientation. Like for instance, in the example I gave about how this, what I call it, bad behavior is widespread, is endemic across the entire Nigerian landscape, from civil service to private businesses to government to governance. What it means is that there is a cultural problem. If the culture of the people is it is our own, so let us share it. It is our own, so let us eat. That it is my turn. What happens is that nobody actually does the work of taking responsibility because everyone believes it is just there to plunder and to share. So to address something like this, there is a need for a cultural reorientation where we pause and begin to think about why things are the way they are and what we need to do to ensure that those who come after us do not behave in the same way that we behave. So there's a need for massive, vast cultural reorientation. So these are some of the examples. There's also the things like technology. Using technology, if we've developed the rules and regulations, we can now deploy technology to ensure that people follow those rules and regulations. So, for instance, when you buy electricity, you are or are supposed to only be charged for electricity that you use. because technology can tell us how much electricity you used. So it's an example. So for instance, in the quota system for the farmland which I described, if people graze there and then we have CCTV or whatever monitoring how many cows you brought in, then we know, for instance, how many days you're supposed to water. It's basically, this is how technology intersects with rules and regulations. So the solutions are out there, but I think the biggest and the most important one for us to address is the issue of culture. If our way, which as we know, culture refers to the way of life of a group of people over a long period of time, if our way of life is a way of life of it is my turn, this is my office, so this is where I make all the money that I need to make in the world, and you're referring to public resources, not even a private investment. If we have that mentality and we take that mentality forward, the tragedy is inevitable. And like the example of the farmland, ultimately, in the end, if nothing changes, there will be nothing for anybody to loot anymore. And everyone will be in abject poverty. We already have high space of insecurity. So we these are some of the outcomes of the tragedy. So I think I've spoken for quite a while, but it's just something I think this is a lens with which we can look at where we find ourselves. There is a tragedy, right? Because we do not yet see what belongs to everybody. In fact, the subtext of the tragedy of the commons is that what belongs to everybody actually belongs to nobody. And if it belongs to nobody, the consequence is that nobody takes responsibility for it. But this is something that must be changed. To reverse it, what we need to now do is to realize that this thing actually belongs to us and therefore we must look after it. And it is only in looking after it that it is able to sustain our lives throughout our lifespan and throughout the lifespan of generations to come. So it's something that we need to go back and have a rethink.